Ukraine did not give up so easily. So does Putin give up on his legacy? Does he give up on the idea that he gets the greater Russia? And the answer is, of course, no. Because if Putin goes, even if he stays in power, and we can debate what would happen internally, even if he stays in power, he's failed. He's failed in his big quest. And there's a thing, and I'm going beyond an analysis, but just as a person that I've observed, you can say, I'm a little bit older than you folks are, that when you get men in power who get to the last few years of their run in power, and Putin is in his 70s, they get more and more determined that they have to succeed. They have to do this because they know they're going to die. That's just it, death comes to all of us. And Vladimir Putin does not want to die without saying, I gave Russia Ukraine. It's as personal as that, as much as it is part of being the Russian system and what it desires in terms of its political or geopolitical position.
Joining us today, Scott Lukas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program.
Thank you both for having me here. It always makes it a good day when I get to chat with you.
US and also US administration has turned against Vladimir Putin's regime. India and China have scaled back its oil supply from Russia after new US sanctions hit Moscow. From your perspective, how significant are the sanctions against Russian economy, and does Vladimir Putin still have any cards to play with President Trump?
Well, with the sanctions, I think we wait and see. I mean, I think it's an important step that has been announced by the Trump administration, one which I would not have expected, let's say 8 months ago, when Donald Trump was trying to get direct talks with the Russians. But now it's like, okay, we're going to sanction Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. And more importantly, you have secondary sanctions. So anyone who trades with Rosneft or Lukoil could be sanctioned by the Americans. And that includes Russia's two largest customers for their oil, China and India. And the question is, of course, will the U.S. impose those secondary sanctions? What we know so far is that Indian state refiners are reducing the amount of oil that they are taking in from Russia. That's very important because India took almost very little Russian oil before February 2022 and the invasion. Now 40% of its oil comes from the Russians, but they're stepping back from that, at least for now. The latest report is that we had a Russian tanker that was en route to India that was turned around in the Baltic Sea, presumably because India said, no, we're not going to take this. I suspect, although it has not been confirmed, there are also talks going on between the Americans and the Indians and other countries to find alternative sources of oil for India, possibly the Gulf states, possibly increased supply from the United States itself. The Chinese, that's a harder position to read. There were some Chinese state refiners that pulled back from taking Russian oil after the American announcement, but most of China's oil from Russia comes through independent refiners. And it's harder to see whether they're cutting back at this point. And of course, the coincidence here is that as I speak to you, it is just after Donald Trump has had his photo opportunity with Xi Jinping in South Korea. There are questions about where the U.S.-China trade talks are going. It's not a trade deal, by the way, despite what Trump says. It's more of a tactical maneuver, especially by the Chinese. But that might intersect with what China does with Russian oil. To make Trump happy to get space, it may decide to pull back from taking some Russian oil, not to completely cut itself off from Moscow, but to score points with the Americans. I think if I was to say this overall, I don't think this is what we would call a game changer. I don't think this is what really brings the Russian economy down, but I think it's a further worry for Moscow amongst a number of economic worries as it tries to maintain this invasion.
Let's cover also a recent visit of Mr. Kirill Dmitriev to the U.S. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent slams Kremlin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev as a Russian propagandist. Dmitriev recently claims that Western sanctions aren't hurting Russia, but the very next day he showed up in the US after US imposed the sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil. What is your take on that? And is Kremlin starting to panic as the sanctions pressure grows?
Well, Mr. Dmitriev wouldn't call it panic, but let's say it was a sign of concern. First of all, Kirill Dmitriev he's had contacts with the Trump camp even before Trump became president in 2017. He was involved in back-channel discussions, for example, with a man named Eric Prince, the founder of the Blackwater Mercenaries, who's very close to Donald Trump. So Dmitriev's worked with the Americans here, and significantly throughout this year, whenever Vladimir Putin has tried to influence, has tried to spin Donald Trump's envoy, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, Dmitriev has been there. So quite clearly, Dmitriev was going out to the United States on a couple of fronts to push back on that sanctions announcement by talking about, oh, we can have great trade relations with you. Don't be mean to us. Now, one front of this was that he wanted to get meetings with Trump officials. But Trump was away. Trump was out of the country. And so he did not get that meeting with Trump. He did not get a meeting with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. Scott Bessent was not there, the Treasury Secretary. He did not get meetings with anyone except maybe Witkoff. And we heard nothing from that meeting. So I think that's a failure from the Kremlin to get into Donald Trump's ear. But equally significant, he tried to do this public relations offensive. I think he was interviewed by Fox. He was interviewed by CNN. He was interviewed by a prominent right-wing podcast with this message of, we're your friend. Why are you hurting us? This is terrible. By the way, we're going to win. So you want to be with a winner. And he finally went too far. As you pointed out, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, when Dmitriev came back and pushed too hard against the American sanctions, Bessent said, this is a Russian propagandist. I think that's a clear sign that the Russian public play for Trump, which we saw, as recently as that phone call to Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago, before Donald Trump met Vladimir Zelensky, I think they're getting diminishing returns from this. So I don't know what their next step is. I suspect maybe try to invite Trump to Moscow. I mean, that's the ultimate thing they can do, is to give him his photo opportunity in Moscow the same way he's getting it with Xi Jinping today in South Korea. But that they don't want to play that card just yet, because if that doesn't go well, where else do they go with their guy, the person they thought they had in their pocket?
Also, Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev says that the war in Ukraine will end within 1 year. According to Reuters, he made this claim during an investment event in Saudi Arabia. What game is Dmitriev playing right now? What is this kind of game? How do you see that?
I'm old enough to remember when Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin said in February 2022 that they were going to win within a few weeks, and we would see Russia in control of Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine. Guess what? That didn't happen. So here we are 45 months later into the full-scale invasion, and Dmitriev says, oh, don't you worry. Don't you worry. We're going to win next year. And that, again, comes back to a point, which is that the Kremlin knows that Donald Trump wants to be with a winner. He does not want to be with a loser or with someone who has failed. And Trump will shift. We know that part of the reason why he moved away from Russia a few weeks ago, although he spins back and forth, was the idea that Ukraine might be in a position to win. So now Dmitriev is telling him, we're going to win this within a year, because, of course, once Russia wins, their narrative is, then we will have these great economic relations with the United States where everybody will make money, including by taking rare earth minerals out of Ukraine, so that the U.S. and Russia can exploit that. And as I said, the problem for Dmitriev is twofold. One is that the Trump administration has a number of people who don't want to listen to that message. And secondly, that the Russians cannot back that up with victory on the battlefield. I mean, as I speak to you, we have yet another report that the Russians may be inside Pokrovsk, which is a city in Donetsk, about 60,000 people in eastern Ukraine. Certainly, you don't want to lose any cities to invaders, but Russia has been trying to take this single city, Pokrovsk, since July 2024. Now, by that calculation, that's 15 months ago. And Dmitriev saying they can get complete victory within the next 12? Yeah. As my grandfather would say, pull the other one, mate.
Also, Dmitriev says that the war in Ukraine will end because there would be a peaceful settlement within 1 year. Also, he said that President Zelensky would already presented the compromise. He just said that President Zelensky had already made a compromise by proposing freezing the front lines according to the current lines. What is your reading of that, and do you feel that Kremlin still has any kind of cards to play with US and other US allies around the globe? Could they just really continue to say that the war in Ukraine would be over, in 1 year, 2 years, 6 months by peaceful settlement, or just move forward with their agenda?
I mean, first of all, Kirill Dmitriev has said the quiet part out loud. I mean, let's unpack that statement. He says Vladimir Zelensky has proposed a settlement based on freezing the front lines. So Russia can hold on to the areas that it occupies for now in the east, in the south, as well as Crimea. Okay, so if that's the case, why haven't you taken that settlement, Mr. Dmitriev? Why haven't you taken that settlement, Mr. Putin? Because you want more. You aren't interested in just taking a settlement. So you've just said the quiet part out loud, that you're the ones that are rejecting the talks. You're the ones that are rejecting the discussions. You're the ones that are insistent on seizing more Ukrainian territory. Thank you for that, because that exposes the Kremlin's propaganda. Now, on that basis, what can Moscow do for that? I think the idea that the Americans will support Russia seizing more Ukrainian territory, we saw that get exposed a couple of weeks ago. That even as Donald Trump said to President Zelensky, no, we're not going to send the Tomahawks to you to strike inside Russia, at least not yet. Trump also said we're going to accept the freeze of the front lines. He didn't say, yes, Russia can have more territory. So Russia's not going to win by getting Trump on its side at this point. What Russia has to do is to try to wear Ukraine down. And to wear Ukraine down, it has to try to limit the American support for Ukraine's resistance. And here I'm talking about something more important than the Tomahawks. It tries to have to limit other American military assistance or military sales through NATO members, such as air defenses. And it has to limit U.S. assistance for financial support of Ukraine and hope that Europe and other countries in the international community cannot afford to keep Ukraine going. So the key element here is not necessarily Donald Trump. It is, can Europe, the EU, individual European countries, other countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, maintain the support for Ukraine to continue to govern itself, to continue to provide public services, and yes, that includes energy as Russia attacks the infrastructure. Can Europe and the international community support that effort as well as supporting Ukraine's military effort? The Kremlin is still gambling. 5 months later, it can break the international community's support of Ukraine. And that's what I'm going to be watching as much as I'm going to be watching Donald Trump's twists and turns.
NBC News is reporting that a new U.S. intelligence assessment warns that Vladimir Putin is more determined than ever to continue the war against Ukraine and to win it on the battlefield. Putin is now dug in deeper than ever, and despite heavy troop losses or major economic problems at home, intelligence officials say that he's still somehow focused on capturing more Ukrainian territory, just to justify the human and financial cost of this war. So what's driving Putin's determination now? Is it about power or it's about survival for him?
That's a really interesting shift in the U.S. intelligence assessment, because there was another report that came out last week that was not noticed as much. And that is that in July, the CIA was actually saying that Putin might be willing to accept a negotiated settlement, but that other elements in the U.S. government, notably the State Department, were saying, no, Putin is still going after maximum demands. So what's interesting now is what you just said, is that the U.S. intelligence community is united on this idea that Putin is not willing to compromise. So that's a change in the CIA's position. Why is that important? It's important because, of course, what happened between July and now is that Putin went and talked to Trump in Alaska on August 15th, and he maintained those maximum demands. He ruined that idea that he was willing to accept a compromise even if Trump favored it. The Trump administration, even those who are not quite as committed to supporting Ukraine, they now realize that Putin will not give them the talks that they want. So why is that? As you ask this, well, I think for you, Sofia, for you, Daniel, for me, for many others in Ukraine, we've thought since February 2022 that Vladimir Putin is not interested in a negotiated settlement. We thought all the way back to the Istanbul talks in March of 2022 that when you could have had a deal at that point, that it was Russia that said, no, we want more. And they imposed an ultimatum. Here we are in October 2025, and I still think the fundamental is this: that in July 2021, Vladimir Putin wrote a long essay where he actually effectively said, Ukraine does not exist as a sovereign, independent nation. Ukraine is part of a greater Russia. And he gave all the stuff about how cultural ties of language, At the end of the day, what he was saying here is, we have the right to go in and take Ukraine. When he did that, by going beyond the military operation since 2014, when he launched the full-scale invasion, he was trying to get his legacy. I am going to leave Russia when I step down from power with the president of Ukraine. That is what I'm going to give. I am going to be a great Russian leader. And sometimes they'll refer to this like Peter the Great was a great leader. Well, Ukraine did not give up so easily. So does Putin give up on his legacy? Does he give up on the idea that he gets the greater Russia? And the answer is, of course, no. Because if Putin goes, even if he stays in power, and we can debate what would happen internally, even if he stays in power, he's failed. He's failed in his big quest. And there's a thing, and I'm going beyond an analysis, but just as a person that I've observed, you can say, I'm a little bit older than you folks are, that when you get men in power who get to the last few years of their run in power, and Putin is in his 70s, they get more and more determined that they have to succeed. They have to do this because they know they're going to die. That's just it. Death comes to all of us. And Vladimir Putin does not want to die without saying, I gave Russia Ukraine. It's as personal as that, as much as it is part of being the Russian system and what it desires in terms of its political or geopolitical position.
And as you said, that Putin will not refuse on this idea of the full occupation of Ukraine. There is also some news that new U.S. sanctions, Ukraine's drone strikes on Russian oil and gas sites, and Europe rushing more weapons to Ukraine could actually force Moscow even to rethink its strategy. But from your perspective, will all these factors be enough to change Vladimir Putin's course, to change his minds, or it will just push him to dig in even harder?
Well, I think the first thing I would say, and I've said it since 2022, is we're in a marathon, not a sprint. I mean, the idea that there's a quick end to this, we all hope for a quick end. I mean, you've just undergone another night of missile and drone attacks. We know we want that to stop. But I have to say to you realistically that this appears to be something that is going to continue for some time. I think in part that's because of the factors that we've talked about, but in part it's because Russia is not on the verge of succeeding. So Ukraine has this space to carry out its counterattacks. At the same time, we have to realize that to say that the Russian economy is going to collapse or that Russians are going to rise up against Vladimir Putin, there's no sign of that at this point. I do think it was interesting, going back to Mr. Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's key advisor. I think it was interesting when he said, we're going to win within a year, because I think he might have tipped off something else. Remember, his specialism is economics. His specialism is reading what's happening with Russia's economy, its banking system, its trade. In view of everything that's happening regarding Ukraine's attacks, regarding the sanctions, regarding the difficulties of running an overheated economy for an invasion, I think Dmitriev may have tipped this off, which is we have a year to finish this. We have a year to finish this and succeed. If we don't succeed by this time next year, we might have to rethink this. Now, I don't know if Vladimir Putin thinks that, but I think certain advisors in the Kremlin may be thinking that their window is 12 months. And again, I think realistically what you're saying here is it's not 12 months that Ukraine can say we're going to defeat Russia. With respect to all our great viewers out there, defeat it. It's 12 months for Ukraine to continue to show he can stand up to Russia, and that the Kremlin cannot walk away with a victory before the economic and the military and the political factors close in on it.
And on Wednesday, President Vladimir Putin oversaw nuclear force drills complete with practice missiles launches. That move came just as his planned summit on Ukraine with U.S. President Donald Trump was suddenly put on hold, and actually also after the implementation of a new U.S. sanctions against Russia. What's your take on that?
Well, we've got where the story's moved on that nuclear front, which is after those nuclear drills you talked about. Vladimir Putin thumped his chest that, oh, look at me. I've got the Burevestnik nuclear-powered missile. Look how tough we are. And then yesterday he said, look at me. I have the Poseidon nuclear-powered, what is an advanced naval drone. Some are calling it a super torpedo. And what I think Putin was doing is he was responding to the prospect that the U.S. might give Ukraine the Tomahawk cruise missiles that would reinforce the attacks it's carrying on inside Russia. And as Putin always does, he did this when tanks were being considered for Ukraine. He did it when HIMARS rocket systems were being considered. He did it when F-16 jets were being considered. He said, don't do this because look at my shiny nuclear weapons that I have, or nuclear powered weapons. So it's bluster. I mean, it's bluster. I don't want to diminish the fact that no one wants a nuclear war, but the fact here is that you and I both know that once Vladimir Putin uses nuclear weapons, if he did, he's lost. He's lost the world. He's lost, any chance of getting a so-called victory, because no one wins over an area that you just scorched. And again, I say this with respect to you because of being in the country where Chernobyl is. You know what that means. So Putin is trying to get the Americans to be like, oh, we're scared of your weapons. He's trying to get Europe to say we're scared of your weapons. And the most effective response to that is simply to brush that aside. Simply do that. And unfortunately, Donald Trump is kind of what we call taking the bait, where he says, oh, we're going to resume testing of nuclear testing in America, whether it means testing of nuclear weapons, testing of nuclear missiles. So it's kind of a distraction. The fundamental here is the United States government needs to consider, are you going to provide the Tomahawks, as well as what you have done, which has been significant. And this is part of the reason why Putin made those statements, which is giving permission for for Ukraine to use the British Storm Shadows and the French Scout missiles, which are already being deployed inside Russia.
Let's cover also this position of Mr. Dmitriev. Don't you think that Dmitry could be more positive about ending the war against Ukraine rather than Vladimir Putin himself, because he has been saying this for a while, like the war in Ukraine would be over very time soon, in 1 year, by peaceful settlement. We are really close to the end of this war. Zelensky ready for a compromise. We are ready to. Moreover, he said that Russia would be ready to allow Ukraine to have sort of security guarantees. What is your reading of his position inside the Kremlin?
Oh, look, there's nothing new that's inside that, because Vladimir Putin has always postured, oh, you guys, after I defeat you, you can have some security guarantees, but we get our security guarantees. And what they mean by Russian security guarantees is Ukraine is not allowed to join NATO. Ukraine does not get a NATO, what we call a NATO 5 guarantee of defense if Russia attacks again. And Ukraine's military would be sharply limited. I mean, that's the position that they took at the Istanbul talks back in 2022. So, Dmitriev can go around saying that, but if his boss in the Kremlin has told Donald Trump, I want the rest of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, if his boss has said, I want Ukraine to be restricted, in terms of its relations with the West, that's what matters. I think what happened is the Kremlin miscalculated here. I think the Kremlin thought that Dmitriev would get a meeting with Steve Witkoff. Now, Witkoff, we know, has been the Trump advisor who arguably is the most pro-Kremlin. We know that every time he saw Vladimir Putin, he came back and he just repeated what the Kremlin was saying in terms of how the war was going. So they thought Dmitriev would meet Witkoff. There'd be some type of press statement, some type of release, because Witkoff, again, you might remember at the last meeting between Trump and Zelensky a couple of weeks ago, he's the one who said, why can't you just give the rest of Donetsk to the Russians? Because a lot of people speak Russian there. So I think the Kremlin looked at that, thought, Dmitriev beats Witkoff, they get this message out, so they regain that diplomatic initiative, not to compromise on the basis of the front lines, but to have a settlement on the basis of Russia getting more territory. And they just messed it up. They just miscalculated, and the meeting didn't go very well, which means even as you and I speak, they're going to be rethinking what their next step has to be.
But do they have any additional cards to play with U.S. administration? Because it seems like it could be a game over for them, because they are run out of any kind of significant cards to play with President Trump.
They need a breakthrough in Donetsk, to be honest with you. They need a breakthrough in Donetsk where they can go to the Americans and say, we're going to win anyway. So you might as well give us the rest of Donetsk, because we are going to take it. And that's why I come back to something I referred to earlier, which is Pokrovsk, this logistics hub. Now, even if Pokrovsk fell, it would not shatter the Ukraine defenses in the remainder of Donetsk, which are pretty well built up, but it would enable the Russians to finally say, we have a great victory here. They need not only to take Pokrovsk, but they need a couple of other victories elsewhere so that someone can go to Donald Trump and say, Russia is the winners. And if they don't get that, I think they're stuck in a position which is what, again, you've endured overnight, which is they try to knock out Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So that Ukraine itself has to say, we can no longer heat our homes. We can no longer provide electricity. We can't, either through our energy grid or through imports, we can't keep this going. So I think the Russians have come back to get the political advantage with Trump. They've got to get some type of military advantage, either from the aerial attacks or on the front line.
Thank you, Professor Lukas, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Sofia. Slava Ukraini.